Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a journey inward. We're going to navigate the incredibly complex and honestly pretty mysterious psychological architecture laid out by the renowned analytical psychologist Carl Jung in his groundbreaking book, Aion. So let's just dive right into this explainer and begin mapping out the deep, uncharted territories of the human mind. So, ask yourself, who is really in control of your everyday actions? Now, you might quickly answer, well, I am, obviously. But are you? Is your conscious mind truly the one driving your life? Or are there these vast, hidden forces operating just beneath the surface? You see, Jung argued that what we think of as ourselves is really just the tip of the iceberg, and the depths below hold incredible sway over our daily reality. Here's how we're going to peel back the layers of the mind today. First, the ego and consciousness. Second, facing the shadow. Third, anima and animus. Fourth, the self and wholeness. And finally, Christ as a psychological symbol. All right, let's start with section 1, the ego and consciousness, the surface of the mind. We so often mistake the ego for our entire personality, right? But Jung defines the ego merely as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. Basically, it's the center of our field of consciousness, but crucially, it is not the totality of the personality. Actually, the ego is surrounded and profoundly limited by a vast, totally unknown inner territory that we call the unconscious. So how deep does this unknown territory actually go? Well, Jung breaks the unconscious down into 3 spatial groups. First, we've got the things just beneath the surface, temporarily subliminal contents we can easily recall voluntarily, like your everyday memories. Then, deeper down, we find unconscious contents that spontaneously erupt into consciousness, totally uninvited. And at the very bottom, contents that are totally inaccessible and completely incapable of ever becoming conscious. Moving right along to section 2, facing the shadow, the first layer. Okay, so what exactly is this shadow? Jung defines it as the dark, emotional, and repressed aspects of our personal unconscious. These are the inferiorities we try to hide, and they are constantly challenging our ego personality. And look, recognizing these traits requires immense moral effort because, well, by our very nature, we fiercely resist seeing our own dark side. We'd much rather just pretend it doesn't exist. And here is the crucial point. Because we resist our shadow, we unconsciously project it onto others. As Jung puts it, one meets with projections, one does not make them. Think about it. Have you ever irrationally hated someone you barely knew? That intense emotion is very often a projection of your own shadow. Jung points out that this kind of projection actually isolates us. It traps us in an illusory world where we think our environment is hostile when really we're just seeing our own unknown face everywhere we look. Let's go even deeper now. Section 3, Anima and Animus, the deep unconscious. Descending deeper still, past our personal shadow, we reach a much older realm. Here we encounter the ancient, collective archetypes that fundamentally shape how we relate to the opposite sex, and honestly, to the world at large. This is known as the syzygy, the pairing of opposites within the psyche. On one side, we have the anima, which is the feminine archetype found in men. It's driven by eros and connective energy, but it's also capable of creating illusions or seduction. On the flip side, we have the animus, the masculine archetype in women, driven by paternal logos and intellect, but often manifesting as stubbornly held irrational opinions. The tension between these opposites causes deep emotional animosity. And when we don't recognize these forces, they completely cloud our everyday human relationships. Which brings us to section 4, the self and wholeness, the core. At this absolute core, we find the totality of the personality, what Jung calls the self, which encompasses both the conscious ego and the vast unconscious layers we just explored. To understand this totality, Jung points to spontaneous symbols our minds produce, like a quaternity or a mandala like you see here. It symbolizes the integration of the 4 elements of the psyche into total wholeness. You can think of it acting almost like a magic circle, literally creating psychological order out of chaos. It represents a unified totality that is far, far greater than just the conscious ego. And historically speaking, this concept of the self often appears through ancient, deeply powerful archetypes. Take, for example, the Roman Mithraic god Aion from the 2nd or 3rd century. Figures like Aion demonstrate that wholeness and the integration of our complete being has been an urgent human pursuit for millennia, spanning across countless cultures and epochs. So this leads us directly to the path of individuation. This is basically Jung's roadmap for psychological maturity. First, you must integrate the personal shadow. Second, you must recognize your projections of the anima or animus. And third, only then can you experience the totality of the self. But Jung gives a really strong warning here. Failing to properly separate the ego from these powerful unconscious figures can lead to psychological inflation. This is where the ego gets swallowed whole by the unconscious, leading to disastrous real-world consequences. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Christ as psychological symbol, the ultimate symbol. Now, here is where Jung steps entirely outside of traditional theology, strictly reframing historical religious figures as a psychological map of the self. He writes that Christ exemplifies this archetype. Psychologically speaking, this figure represents a symbol of divine totality, the imago Dei, or God image in man. It's the idealized, spotless half of the self that bridges the split in the human personality. In the language of the psyche, he's the ultimate image of psychological perfection and oneness. But as you might guess, this perfection introduces a massive psychological problem. What about evil? Traditional Christian consciousness, heavily influenced by thinkers like St. Augustine, viewed evil through the doctrine of privatio boni. This basically means evil is merely an accidental lack of perfection, an absence of good rather than a real substantial thing in and of itself. Jung, however, pushes back against this theological view using empirical psychology. While theology states evil is just an absence of good, Jung argues that evil is a very substantial, empirical reality in the human psyche. You simply cannot have light without a shadow. Therefore, if the Christ figure represents the exclusively good, perfect light of the self, psychological law dictates there must be a dark half to balance it out for true wholeness. Good and evil aren't just lopsided. Light and shadow are coexistent, equivalent halves of human nature. And that dark half is exactly what Jung identifies as the psychological antichrist. Now, Jung explains this entirely neutrally as a mechanism of the mind. Basically, as the Christ image became more perfect and differentiated in history, the laws of psychology dictated the rise of an equally powerful unconscious shadow. It's not a moral judgment at all. It's just the inevitable counterstroke required to restore balance to a one-sided perfection. Which brings our journey to a truly powerful climax. Jung says that the progressive development and differentiation of consciousness leads to an ever more menacing awareness of the conflict. He says it involves nothing less than a crucifixion of the ego, its agonizing suspension between irreconcilable opposites. Let that sink in. True self-knowledge means the ego must painfully hold the tension between our absolute good and our absolute evil. It is a profound and frankly grueling psychological undertaking. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. We've explored the surface ego, the personal shadow, the anima and animus, and the ultimate totality of the self. The question for you is, are you truly ready to gaze into the face of your own absolute shadow? It takes incredible courage to undertake this inward journey of individuation, but according to the source material, it's the only true path to psychological wholeness. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity to learn even more about the hidden depths of your own mind.